everyone. Welcome to day 3 of our Front-End Fundamentals Bootcamp for the Australia cohort. And we want to thank you again for making it to day 3. So what we're going to discuss for tonight is going to be continuing our HTML forms. So for this, let us delve deep into things all about HTML and even having an intro to CSS. So let's try and go back to our VS Code right here. If we remember the file that we used yesterday, we started off with a forms.html that was discussed by Ron. So let's open that up. And if you have that open on your end, just give a thumbs up to my forms message here in the chat box if we are ready and have it open on our system. Thank you, May. Thank you as well, Pauling. And thank you, Prayash. Right. So now that we have our forms ready and open, let us first have a little review. What does this forms contain? Well, let's try and open it up here on the left side in my browser. I'll right-click and open with Live Server to show a preview of what this looks like. And we can see in here, creating forms. And we started off with a name, an email, and a password. So pretty much 3 fields that could contain certain data. But these aren't the only fields that are available in HTML, as there are so much more that we could discuss. So let's try and add some more. Let's create another div right here after password. And let's say it will be for our, we'll say number or age. Right, so this field is going to contain a numerical value. So is it possible with an HTML input to only filter it to only take in numerical values? The answer for that is yes, it is possible, thanks to a certain input of type number. So we'll type in input right here, and we'll do a colon, and we'll say number. So this is a shortcut to make an input of type number. So we'll just hit on tab if we're highlighted on this tooltip right here. Hit on tab. It will generate input type number along with a name and an ID that may refer to the certain input. So this name and ID will make it so that if we're going to give it functionality later, or maybe select it to give it some styling, we could use either the name or the ID to refer to this element. So let's follow the format that was done with the inputs right here. And let's make it so that the attributes are put on the next line. Like this. There you go. That looks a lot better. So say for this, we'll say the name will be age. The ID will also be age. The tab didn't work for you? Oh, okay. If it doesn't work for you, you could check your file and preferences. Then let's go to settings. So for settings right here, we'll say emit and make sure that it is turned on. So by default, it should be turned on. So I'm not sure why you are not seeing it on your end. Okay, well, if you're not seeing the emit tooltips on your end, you could just type it out manually, and you could refer to the code that I'll send in the chat later on. So you can still follow along with the discussion. Okay, so with that being said, let's continue on with this input because we are not yet done. Right here, you can see that we have an input that could take in number values. And if you try to put in things like maybe a letter, it'll accept an E because E is actually a numerical value. And I'm unsure what that value will be equal to. but it should be something related to math. But if you try and type in any other letters, notice how they aren't going to be taken in. That's because this input can only accept numerical values. So let's try and put in some more attributes to this input. Let's say I want to put in a placeholder. So this placeholder right here could be placeholder of 30, or maybe you could put in here your age. So basically, this placeholder will indicate what this can contain, or maybe a sample value that you may append this with. For example, maybe the default age they could be is 30 years old. And let's also have a required attribute to make it so that this field will be filled in. And if it's not filled in, it would not submit the form, making it a required field to fill in. Okay. So now our input is done. We are not yet done with this. We still need to put a label like the previous fields right here. So we'll say label. And right here, we have a for. And if we remember what for was for yesterday, it is to link a certain label, let's say age, to a certain input. So when we click on the label, it will auto-focus our cursor into the input. So we could fill it in by clicking on the label or clicking on the input itself. Makes for a bit of user accessibility. And that's going to do it for our number or age input. So let me send that in the chat box for your reference. So you could paste that into your code editor if you would like. Okay. So that is for our number and age. And if you have that on your end, you could give a thumbs up to my latest message. Thank you, Pauling. Thank you, May. And thank you, Prayash. All right. So let's say we have a bunch more fields. Let's put in something that we call a text area. So let's create another div. Right here, this div will contain another input, but this time we aren't going to use the input tag. What we're going to use is the text area tag. So let's type that out right here. And it will give us this set of fields right here, a text area with a name, an ID, columns, and rows. So columns and rows pretty much dictate its initial width and height. So its width will be dependent on the columns, how many letters you can fit inside of the horizontal area, and how many lines you want to create. So that would be your rows. So in total, you could type out like 30 letters in one row, and it will span 10 rows. So that is for setting the initial width and height of a text area. And notice how it's a lot wider than your typical input. And that's because this meant to take in basically a long line of text. So this could be something like a message or an address. And in this case, if it's not going to fit them, or if this input or this text area is still a little bit too small, they have the option to expand or compress the text area. If you want to disable this feature, unfortunately, that is an attribute that comes with CSS. So if we have the time, we will talk about how to remove that feature. But for now, by default, it always has this extend or expand or compress feature with the text area. All right. So here for this text area, we'll give it a name. And let's say this name is going to be message. Its ID is going to be message as well. And we could say columns of 30, and maybe our message is not going to be 10 rows long. So let's say we'll make it 3. And there you go. That is a pretty apt amount of space for a certain message. And here, right before the div, let's put in another label. We'll say label right here will be for message. And it will say message in between the opening and closing tag. So there you go. The message is now showing with a label beside of it. So you could fill in name, email, password, age, and the message for this. And of course, let's put in a comment in here to signify what this represents. This is going to be our message. Okay, let me send this in the chat right here for your reference. So feel free to paste that into your editor. And let's move on to the next type of input. So for the next type of input, we have div. And for this div, we're going to be using something that we call the select. So in websites, we normally notice things like drop downs or things with multiple choices that allow us to pick a certain choice. So these drop downs are their certain term or proper term in HTML would be select tags. So we want to use these tags to limit the user's options to a certain amount. For example, we have a select. Let's hit on tab for this as well. And let's fill in the contents of this select. Let's say the select will be the gender. And we'll also make the ID gender as well. Okay, so that is for our select right here. And for the select, it kind of works like an unordered or ordered list where it could contain things that we call options. So we'll type in OPT, hit on tab, and we'll notice the option tag come right out. So this option tag right here will be given a certain value attribute. So later on, if the form is going to be submitted, we'll know what kind of value the user has selected. For example, we'll say the first option value will be male. So put in male. And then let's make another option. Let's say the option for our next one will be female. So we'll say female. And lastly, we'll have another option that is for others. For those who have another gender. So there you go. And that is for our select. And notice what has rendered out on the left side of our screen. We have male, female, and others for that as well. So you could make this into any kind of drop down that you want. Maybe it doesn't have to be gender. Maybe in this case, you could have them pick their favorite food, their favorite color, pretty much anything that you want to limit to a certain amount of choices. The select is a great way to choose. Okay, and for this, let's put in another label. And for this label, we'll say the label is for gender. And we'll say gender with colon to make it cohesive like the other inputs. And we'll give a comment right here. This comment will be for our select, which is for the gender. There you go. And that is for our select element. So I'm going to send this in the chat as well. Right? So if you have the message and the select as well in your code editor, yep, there you go. Thank you, Pauling. Feel free to give a thumbs up to my latest message. Thank you, May. And thank you, Prayash. All right. So let us continue on. Right here, after the gender, we are not yet done. We have some more to discuss. Let's say, for example, we have a div right here. And let's say this div will contain an input of type, we'll say :radio. So input :radio and hit on tab will let us generate an input with a type of radio. So right here, we could say the input of type radio can have a certain name. Let's say the name is going to be status, where we want to have them pick certain statuses. Because notice here on the left, it's given us a circle button. And if we click on it, it will select. All right. So let's say the ID of this first status, maybe it could be public. I will say the value for this is also going to be public as well. All right. So we're going to give this a certain kind of label right beside the input. So we'll say label, and this label will be for public, and we'll say public for the first radio button. So notice right here, the radio button has the public word right beside it. So let's do the same thing, except let's copy all of this and change public to private instead. So say this will be an ID of private. The value will be private as well. The label will be for private, and the text here will be for private, like so. All right, so now we have our little radio group. This allows us to select which option we want to choose. But for the radios, we could only select one of these values. So let's try and demonstrate that. If I click on public, and then I click on private, notice how public is now deselected. Same thing with if I pick public after choosing private. It will deselect the previous option. So radios right here allow you to group these together if they have the same name. So notice how they have the same name. It's a name of status. So if they are in the same name, that means these two are now grouped together, and that means you could only select one of these in a radio. Since radio is only meant to have a singular choice from multiple values. It's kind of like a drop down, except it is more of clicking a certain choice and seeing a button for clicking it compared to just a normal drop down. So you could take your pick which one will apply to you a lot better. All right, so that is for our div with input of type radio. So let me put in a comment in here. We're going to say status. All right. And I'll send this in the chat for your reference. All right, don't worry, we're almost done. The next thing that we have is going to be for our check boxes. So let's try and look at that. Here we'll say div. And this div can first have an input with type checkbox. So we'll put an input :checkbox to do so. Hit on tab and notice it's almost the same as our radio button. Instead, now our button is now square instead of circle. So what's the difference between the two? Well, there's a major difference, and we're going to demonstrate that after we've coded our HTML. So right here, let's say the name of this is going to be movies. And then ID will also be movies. And the value will be movies as well, in case the form needs the value of this content. All right, so now I have the first input. And after that, let's do it just like our status right here. Let's create a label for our movies, like so, and we'll make it movies. Or maybe instead of movies, we'll say watching movies. There you go. So that is our first option. So let's create a second option right here. What we're going to say is input with another type of checkbox. And for this, what we're going to say is name reading book. And we'll also have an ID, which is also reading book. And the value of this is going to be book. All right. So as for our input, notice how we now have two checkboxes here on our preview. So what we're going to say is label for reading book, and we'll say reading a book. All right. So that is good to go. So notice how just like our radio buttons, these two are now right beside each other. But if I click on one of them and then I click on the other one, notice how the previous one was not deselected. So for checkboxes, these are normally multiple selectors. So you could select as much as you want. You could even select all of them or select none of them as well. So right here, if I click on watching movies, it will take in that I watch movies. Or I could also read the book as well. Or I could do both. So this is very helpful when it comes to creating multiple choices in a single format. All right, so that is for our checkbox. So let me create a comment in here. And this will be, maybe we'll call this hobbies. And I'll send this into our chat box. Okay, so feel free to copy and paste that into your editor. And we're almost done with our forms, so no need to worry. What we need to do next is put in some buttons. So for buttons, these could be things that will allow you to submit, or these could be things that will allow you to pretty much send your form data to a different service. But for now, let's create these buttons right here on the very bottom. We're going to see the first one will be button of type reset. So what can this reset button do? Let's say, for example, I'll say John, and then put in a random password. Then I'll click on the reset. Notice how all of our fields ended up getting cleared out. So that's what the button of type reset is. It's going to reset the form that it is currently inside of. In this case, it is this form right here, which pretty much has all of the inputs that we created yesterday and today. All right. So we also have one more kind of button right here. We'll say button with a type of submit. So this will have a submit text in between. So let's see the difference between both. What we're going to say here is the name could be John. The email could be John as well, john@email.com. And the password here could be anything. All right, so I filled in 3 fields so far, the name, email, and password. So let's click on the submit button. And what do we notice? Thanks to HTML5, it will allow us to know if there are certain warnings without needing to put in any programming. So for example, this field has a required attribute. If we go back here to our age, it has the required attribute, meaning they need to fill in this field before submitting, or else they're going to get a warning message that looks like this. Of course, if you don't want it to be required, you could just remove the keyword entirely and you won't need to fill it in to submit the form. All right. And let's say I do fill that in. I'll say 40. If I click on submit, notice how nothing much has happened. Well, that's because HTML is not responsible for handling complex calculations. It's just meant to display things on your page. But let's see what we do notice. Here in our URL, notice how right beside our URL, we see the name, email, password, and age, and message. Yep. So the up and down arrows on the age can be set to negative numbers. Is there a way to stop that? There actually is. So for that, let's use the attributes right here. Let's go back to number right here. There you go. And we could say something like min. So for min in here, it could be the minimum value that a user could enter. So for here, maybe their minimum age could be 0 or maybe 1. So let's say min of 1. So if I press this, it will, if I try and click on the down arrow, it will stop at the number 1, since that is the minimum that we've set. And for setting a maximum, that is also possible by putting in max. And for max, maybe we don't want them to be over 60. So fortunately, people who are senior citizens will not be able to submit a form. So right here, let's say 59 and then 60. If I try to go higher than that, it will no longer do that since our maximum was set to 60. Okay, hopefully that was able to answer your question, May. All right. So right here, when we click on submit, notice how our fields are pretty much the fields that we filled in right here. So this is kind of like simulating it being passed on to a different service or parsing our form to show something or pretty much process our form. Difference between button and input type button. So the difference between both is actually not much difference at all. So if you try and let's say right here, input of type button. So in here, you could put a certain value, and the value over here will be click me. And let's say we'll put in a button as well. And for this button, we'll say click me as well. So notice how both of those don't really have much difference at all. The main difference, I guess, would be the value will set what is inside of our button. So for the button that is just the normal button, it puts the text content in between the opening and closing tag. Okay, so that is for our input and the normal button. There isn't much difference at all, so it's more of a matter of preference which button you would like to use. If you prefer everything to be an input, you could opt for the input area. But if you prefer buttons to be buttons, you could try using buttons for the clickable things like reset and submit. Okay. So let me remove those for now. There you go. So we'll have reset and submit. Right, another question, does the max min function work the same for dropdown? For example, when you want to select your birthday, month, year. All right, so for that, that's most likely going to interpret or implement some JavaScript code, because unfortunately, I'm having things like wanting to select your birthday or month or year is most likely in the domain of filtering out the contents of a certain dropdown. And for that, we would most likely need to implement some JavaScript to make that possible. So with just HTML, I believe that is not yet currently possible. So hopefully that answers your question, May. All right, and glad I was able to address that. Right, with that being said, that is going to be the last thing for our HTML forms. So you could take inspiration from this right here. Let me send these in the chat. The last buttons, here you go. You could paste these on your end, and you should be good to go to create some forms on your end. Since we pretty much discussed the most used types of inputs along with the buttons for creating your own forms. All right. So that pretty much wraps up the forms, and hopefully you were all able to get everything so far. So if you're good with the forms currently, just give a thumbs up to my latest message in the chat right here. Thank you, Prayash, and thank you, May. Why is that for button you don't use div? All right, great question. So for that, I did it in that way because we use the divs here to kind of like break them into their own sections. Notice when I put in div right here, or take out the divs for the hobby. Notice how our reset and submit button ended up moving right beside our watching movies and reading a book. So putting things in divs makes it so that it will reserve lines for the contents of the divs. So this a div, this a div, and this a div. So without the divs, most likely all of these are just going to end up all being beside each other. And of course, we want our form to go from top to bottom instead of left to right, since the more modern websites would render out content from top to bottom. Of course, you could also replicate that same effect by using BRs like that to kind of make line breaks for certain elements. But this div approach makes things organized, so you could put fields in their own space, and maybe later on give them some certain styling. And it's great for grouping elements as well. All right. And I was able to answer your question, Colin. All right. So that is going to be it for our forms, and hopefully we are good to go. So that's for our forms, right? So our next order of business is going to be our intro to CSS. So let me change my screen right here. And let's go to the first one, CSS Basics. Let me share my screen once again. Right here. Okay. So now, let's start off with the basics of the basics. Let's start with actually talking about what CSS is. So right here in my CSS basics, let's first start with the 3 ways on how we could include CSS into our project. Before that though, let's create a new file here in our CSS basics folder, and let's type in 3-ways-css.html. Okay, so let me send that file name in the chat so you could copy the file name as well and create it in chapter 4, the CSS basics folder. And once you have that file created, give a thumbs up and let's start talking about CSS. All right, thank you, May. Let's wait for the rest. Thank you, Prayash. And thank you as well, Pauline. All right, so in here, in our CSS basics, what we're going to do is first, let's create our HTML template. So if, for example, I type in an exclamation point, and if I hit on tab, notice how it generates our HTML code for us. This is a review of what we did yesterday. So this gives us the boilerplate code that allows us to generate a web page. So what we need to do now is open it in our live server. So right click and open with live server to show it on the side right here. That is now our live preview. Okay, that's for our live preview here on the left. So what we're going to do is let's fill this in with some HTML. First thing we're going to do is fill this in with a comment. And let's discuss first what CSS is. All right. So before we actually implement some CSS, let's give a bit of discussion. What does anyone know what CSS stands for? Because CSS, much like HTML, is also an acronym. Correct me. That is cascading style sheets. So the reason for that is because CSS is meant to style our HTML. So if the HTML is meant to structure the elements on the page, the CSS is meant to change their colors, change their positionings, pretty much add visual appeal to our web page. So we could talk about why it's cascading. And the reason for that is something that we could talk about later on once we actually implement some CSS. So let's try and talk about that in here. In the body, let's create some elements to actually style. Let's say for this, we'll start off with a paragraph tag. This paragraph tag can have a class. We'll say the class of this will be external styling. And we'll say this is a paragraph with external styling. All right, we'll just copy this and make it on the next line. We'll say this will not be external, it will be internal styling. So we'll explain what these are after creating the HTML. And lastly, we'll have this, where we have, instead of a class, we're going to use something called the style attribute. We'll fill that in with some content later on, and we'll say this paragraph has inline styling. All right, let's put some comments for each of these as well. This will be external. This will be internal. And this will be inline. All right. So that is for our CSS right here. So for this, let me send the code first in the chat before we actually implement some CSS. And let's discuss the 3 ways in which we could put in CSS in our file. So if you have that on your code editor as well, just give a thumbs up. And apologies if I'm asking a lot of thumbs up, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Thank you, Poleng. Thank you, May. Thank you, Prayash. All right. So let us discuss what these 3 ways are going to refer to. So when we think of external, what do we what are our first impressions? External would mean something that is outside, or something that is not part of what we are currently in. External. It's on the outside. So when we think of external, here in CSS is going to be linking to a file that is outside of this HTML. So let's say, for example, here in my file system, I have a CSS file that is in the same folder as our HTML, but it's its own separate file. So in order to put in external styling, we're going to need to make a link to that external file and link it to this HTML to give styling to this page. So to do that, what we're going to do is let's make a CSS file. We'll say the file will be called styles.css. Hit on enter for that. And let me send that file name as well in the chat for your reference. Okay, so this is our external file. So to link it into our HTML, we're going to refer to the head section, which is meant for linking CSS files and our metadata. Right here, what we're going to do is, let's make a comment and we'll say this will be for our external styling link. All right, so for this, what we're going to say is we're going to use the link tag. So the link tag is not like the anchor tag. The anchor tag is different. It is a teleporter to bring you to different resources. But the link is meant to link external resources to this page. So I'll say link right here, and notice when I hit on tab, it will generate things like a relationship of style sheet and an href as well. So relationship of style sheet is pretty similar to what we have here in our CSS. So the style sheet is meant to change the style or change the look of our web page. Right, so if we have the relationship of style sheet, let's put in a certain href. So for the href of this, it pretty much works like how we did the HTML when we put in the src. You need to put in the address of what of where the file is going to be. In this case, since it is in the same folder as our HTML, you can just put in the file name like so. We'll put in styles.css, and we should have the file successfully put inside of our, or imported inside of our page. Right. So the next thing to do for this is let's create some styling for our external styling right here. So for styling this, you could do multiple kinds of ways to select this certain element. We'll go more into selectors later on, of course. But for this, let's say, for example, I want to target the class and say if they have a class of external styling, then we'll give them a certain style. All right. So to select a certain class, what we're going to do is let's go to our styles.css file right here. And let's put in a dot. A dot is something that refers to a class. Since we're looking for a class right here, we use the dot to refer to it. And we'll say dot along with the name we're looking for. In this case, we're looking for the name of external styling. So let's put that external dash style. And after that, we're not yet done. We need to put in a set of curly braces. And this pretty much starts off our CSS block. So for a CSS block, it contains two parts. One would be our selector, pretty much what we're going to style on the page. And inside are going to be the properties that we want to change for this certain element that we selected. All right. So we'll go over the types of selectors later on, but for now, let's use this external dash styling to change the styling of our page. For this, let's say the color will be blue, and the font size will be 18 pixels. All right, what do we notice right here on our page? The external styling ended up targeting this paragraph right here, and it gave it a color of blue, meaning change the text or font color, and a font size of 18 to make it a bit bigger compared to the other paragraphs. All right, so that is for our external styling. We've pretty much put in styling in a separate file and linked it to our HTML to give styling to our external styling class and change the style here on our page. All right, so that is for our external styling. Let me copy the styles.css contents in here and send it in our chat box. So if you're good to go, feel free to give a thumbs up to my latest message here in the chat box. Okay, thank you, Poleng and May. All right, let's wait for the rest. Okay, thank you as well, Prayesh. Right, let's go over the two other ways on how we link CSS to our page. So for this, let's say internal styling. So instead of linking to a file that's outside of this HTML, we could also use internal styling, where we could have a certain tag that contains our CSS logic. For example, let's have something in here. Let's say internal styling here in a comment. And we'll say after that, we're going to put in a tag that we call the style tag. The style tag is meant to take in CSS code to pretty much change the style of this singular web page. So if you want to put in styling like this to other kinds of pages, I would opt for the external styling instead of the internal styling, since this meant for singular or specific pages. Right, so for our style right here, let's say it'll start with dot, and then dot, if you remember, will refer to a certain class. Now, since we're going for internal styling, it's only apt that we select the internal styling class. So let's do that. We'll say internal dash styling, and we'll put in a set of curly braces right here to signify the start of our CSS blocks properties. Okay, so for internal styling, let's say what we do here is we'll change the color of it to be the color red. So notice how our internal styling paragraph has changed styling right here. Now it's color red. And we'll also change the font size. Let's say font size of this is going to be 20 pixels. So notice how the font got a bit bigger than it was a while ago. That's because we were able to implement internal styling to style our paragraph. Okay, so that is for internal styling. So let me send that code here in our chat box. Okay, so we're not yet done. We also have one right here at the bottom. This is an example of inline styling. So for inline styling, it's much like the CSS blocks here in internal and in external. But instead of putting it in those areas, what we're going to do is put it right beside the element. So it's great for making specific styles for a certain unique element. But the bad part about this is it will only be applied to that one element. So this is more for specific purposes if you want to change one certain thing or one certain element's style. All right, so for this, we'll give it a style and we'll say, firstly, the color will be green for this paragraph right here. And the next thing will be, we could change its font size as well. We'll say the font size will be 16 pixels. All right, so it's not very noticeable that we change the font size. So let's say it'll be 19. There you go. So that is how we style our elements in line. We say properties, and between them, we give semicolons to dictate the ends of statements. So this allows us to put in color greens and font size right here, right beside the paragraph. Okay, and that's going to do it for the three ways in which we create in CSS. So let me send that right here in the chat box. Okay, hopefully you're all still good to go because we have a lot more to discuss. If you're good to go with this current code, feel free to give a thumbs up to my latest message in the chat. All right, thank you, May, Poleng, and Prayash. Right, so let's move on to the next topic. Let's start off with CSS typography. So let me get this right here. So for typography, it's much like for P class, P style. Are we able to type tab to get suggestion? I miss how you did it. Ah, yes. So for getting suggestions, you can see right here, if I say P and hit on tab, then I could say style right after the tag was generated. So say style, and this will let us put in certain elements or certain properties that we want to change for this style. Of course, there's a lot, so we need to know which style we want to change for this certain element. So that's something that we need to type manually. Okay, hopefully that answers your question, Pauline. And yep, no problem. And that should be good to go for our 3 ways dash CSS. All right, so let's move back to our file explorer. Our next point of discussion is going to be for typography. So let's try and do that. Here in our CSS basics, let's create a new file, and we're going to call it typography.html. This will be for discussion of typography. And we should see right here, typography.html has been successfully created. Let me send that file name as well in the chat right here. Okay, so that is for typography. So let's talk about what this will contain for typography. Let's say right here, let's have some more HTML boilerplate. We'll say an exclamation point and hit on tab to generate our HTML page template. We are going to right click and open the live server to see a blank slate right here for our typography.html. Okay, hopefully you were all able to do it as well. So what we're going to do is create a bunch of divs. The first div will be div, I will say dot font dash family dash size. All right, so for the font family size, right here, we'll hit on tab. It will let us generate a div with a class of font family size. A little shortcut for you to try out. And for this, we'll say this changes font family and size. Okay, so we're going to show some properties that do that later on. The next one will be for a div of class bold. So we'll say div.bold, hit on tab, and it gives us a class of bold, and this will say changes format to bold. Okay, so next one for this is going to be div with a class of italic, and for this we'll say changes format to italicized. Okay, next one is div with a class of underline, and we'll say this will add underlines. Next is div dot center align. So for this will allow you to center text. We'll show the property for that later. Okay, we'll make this centers instead of center. All right, and for this, next up we have div with a class of line through. Okay, and we'll say this adds. And for this, what we're going to say is div class line through, and we'll say this adds a line through for this certain div. All right, we're not yet done. We have 3 more things that we need to create. We'll say div with a class of line height, and this will set the line height. We have div with a class of letter spacing, and this sets letter spacing. All right, we also have div with a class of text shadow. So this one will add text shadow. And that is going to do it for our body. So we definitely have a lot of properties to discuss right here for our typography. So let's put in a little H1 in here to signify what this is going to be talking about. This is for our CSS typography. Okay. And that is going to do it. Oh, looks like I need to change this to format instead of format. There you go. And that's going to do it for our CSS typography. All right. So hopefully on your end, let me send this code in the chat so you could copy and paste it on your end. All right. And if you have that as well on your code editor, feel free to give a thumbs up right here. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Prayash, May, and Poleng. So what we're going to do is give some styling to these certain divs and let us see what they necessarily contain. All right, so for our typography, we could either opt for making an external link or we could make it internally. So personally, since we don't want to have too much files in our folder, I opt for the internal style. So we create a style tag right here, on tab, and we'll put in the CSS for this one page, web page, right here in the style tag. All right, so let's get discussing for this. So for the style, what we can start off first with is dot, and we'll say font family size. We'll try and go in order for this. All right, so now we've created a CSS block. Let's start styling. So for this, for the font family and size, we could change the font family of certain elements. In this case, it could be something like Arial. And Arial is a sans serif font, so we tell the browser that. And notice how our font family or the type of font being used by the statement is different compared to the rest. This would be Arial, and the rest would be the default, which is normally Times New Roman. All right, so that is for our font family. But we also have another property right here. This for our font size. So we've already established how that works a while ago, but let's use it again. So you can put a certain unit of measurement to signify how big our element is going to be, or how big the text is going to be in the element. In this case, maybe we want it to be 20 pixels. So there you go. Notice how it is bigger compared to the rest of the elements. So that is for our font family size. All right, next up we have dot bold. And for dot bold, this will be using the property that we call font weight. So if you don't want to use the B tag or the EM tag to emphasize certain text, you could just use the font weight, and you could use a certain number, or you could use bold to change a certain element to bold. All right, so that's not the only thing that we have. We also have dot italic, and this uses the font style. So font style right here will change how the font is going to look. In this case, either normal or italicized. All right, so for this, let's say the font style for this will be italic. And notice what happens to our format right here. It has changed to slanted letters, meaning it is correctly italicized. Right, next up we have dot underline, and this uses a certain property that we call text decoration, pretty much adding decoration to specific parts of our text. So for this, let's say it could start off with an underline. And notice what happens right here. Our element now has an underline underneath both of them. So we've now implemented a text decoration of underline to our page. All right. Next up, we have dot center dash align. And for this, we're going to try and align this text to the center of the screen. Okay, so for this, we're going to use a certain property that we call text align. So text align will let us put our content on the left, or put the content on the right, or put it in the center. So to put in the center, we'll say center, like so. And notice where our text is going to go. It goes into the middle of the screen. So if we try and zoom it in, notice how it still stays in the center of the screen. That is thanks to, let's go back to our code. That's thanks to the text align property. Okay. So that is going to be for center align. Of course, we have a bunch more to discuss. So let's discuss these. After center align, we have the dot line through. Okay. So for line through, right here, we could also use a text decoration. We'll say text decoration for this will be line through. And notice what happens. It puts a line through all of the words inside of the line through class. Yeah. So that's for our line through. We also have things like line height. So for line height, it's going to be the space between every line. In this case, it's like 1 or 1.15. Well, in this case, if we want to make our line height a lot more, you could say something like line dash height will be 1.5 steep. Will be 1.5 right there. So there you go. So that is for our line height. So if we try and notice its line height, maybe let's try and make it a bit more obvious. We'll say 20. Notice what happened to our line. We've made certain space at the top and the bottom to space out this line compared to the other texts. Of course, we'll try to make it a bit more subtle. We'll just make it 1.5. There we go. To give it a bit of breathing room. Of course, you could apply this line height to the whole paragraph if you want to make it consistent with all of the lines. All right, we're not yet done yet though, because we also have letter spacing. So for letter spacing, dash spacing, for this, it will be the spaces between each letter. So let's say for this, letter spacing, you could say letter spacing will now be 2 pixels. And notice what happened right here. It pretty much put 2 pixels of space between each element. It's kind of like it's separating each of the letters into its own thing. That's thanks to letter spacing. All right. And lastly, for our typography, let's say we have a text shadow. So for this text shadow, we could use the property text shadow, like so. And for this, we could put in certain pixel values, let's say 2 pixels, 2 pixels, 4 pixels, and its color will be black. There you go. So let's try and dissect what's happening here in the text shadow, because maybe some people are not very familiar with what's happening right here. So for this, the first text shadow unit of measurement right here, we're going to represent, let's try and mess with this right here, say 12. It will mess with the horizontal offset of our shadow. So if we give it a positive value, it will move the shadow a bit more to the left. And if we give it a negative value, it will move it from the right. Okay, so negative value will be to the left, positive value will be to the right. There you go, that's the correct order. All right, so let's say, for example, I give a negative value right here, we'll say -2. It will move to the left of the source or the text. All right. For now, we'll leave it as like this for our horizontal offset. So if we have this for horizontal offset, for our vertical offset, this is the value for that. So now you can see that it's 2 pixels, meaning that we are 2 pixels moved down. If we give it, for example, -2, it will move our shadow 2 pixels a bit higher than the source or the text. For now, we'll leave it at 2 pixels and 2 pixels. And lastly, we have 4 pixels right here. This will determine how far we want the shadow to spread. For example, if we have 40 pixels, this is not very visible as it's meant to be a blur. If we have 10 pixels, notice how it is a lot more spread out compared to 4 pixels. So this allows you to increase the blur radius. However, if you reach a certain point where the blur radius is too big, the shadow is not going to be very visible. All right. So the more blurry it is, the more wide its certain shadow will be. But the less blur radius there is, let's say 4, the more focused the shadow is going to be. And that is going to be for our text shadow. All right, so hopefully that gives you a bit of context as to how our typography is going to work. All right, so let me send this style in the chat for your reference. And feel free to give a thumbs up if you have the same style on your end as well. Thank you, Poleng. Let's wait for the rest. Thank you, Prayash. And thank you as well, May. All right, we've definitely talked about a lot of CSS so far. So what we're going to do is take a 15-minute break to recharge our energy and be ready for some more CSS discussions. So let's all be back in 15 minutes. Let's all be back by 8:30. So we are going to see you then. All right, hello everyone. And hopefully we're all back from the break. So let me once again share my screen. Right here. There you go. So hopefully you're all back. If you're all good to go, feel free to give a thumbs up to the ready message I have in the chat box. Thank you, Poleng. Let's wait for the rest. Okay. I hope the others are also here. Give a thumbs up to the ready message if you are here. All right. Thank you, May. Okay. So I think we can proceed for now. So let's make another HTML in here. We'll say the new file right here will be something called selector.html right here. And let's hit on enter to create some selectors or talk about selectors in this HTML file. All right, hopefully you also made that file on your end. So once that HTML file is created, we'll use the exclamation point and hit on tab right here to generate our HTML boilerplate. And let's open it with Live Server here on our browser. So there you go. You should see the preview here on the left side. All right. So hopefully you're also able to do it on your end. And let's talk about the different kinds of selectors. All right. So for this, there are different kinds of selectors. So let's first start with putting some comments right here. There you go. So firstly, a comment. We'll start off with the element selector. So an element selector is based on the certain name that we have for that element. In this case, let's say, for example, I have a span element. The span element could contain some text. So let's say this is styled using an element selector. So right here, we're going to give that some styling later on. Next up, we have class. So our class selector is much like how we targeted the ones a while ago in the typography. We use the certain class that's linked with the element. In this case, let's have paragraph tag with a class of, let's just say class name. Of course, you could change this to be another kind of class if you want to do so. This is styled using a class selector. All right. And lastly, we have our ID selector. So say ID selector right here. And this would be for a paragraph tag with an ID of ID name. So to make an ID, we'll put in a pound sign and we'll put the name of the ID. In this case, let's say ID-name and hit on tab to create an ID right here with a specific name. In this case, this is styled using an ID selector. All right, so that is going to be our HTML so far. We have one for element selector, one for class selector, and one for ID selector. So what we're going to do is target these specific things and style them using CSS. All right, so let me send this code in the chat. And if you're seeing the same thing as me, feel free to give a thumbs up to my latest message. And let's start off with some CSS. Thank you, May. Let's wait for the rest. Thank you, Poleng. All right. Okay, I think that is going to do for now. Right, let's have a review. In our head, what tag do we need to have internal CSS in our HTML? What tag do we use? Just remember, internal. You could type your guess in the chat. Just to help make sure that you have the learnings well learned. There you go. Thank you, May. Yep, that's correct. It's going to be the style tag. So in this case, yes, I'm going to use internal CSS once again. If you want to make external CSS, you're free to do so. Just create a link tag with a link to an external file. In this case, I'll just use the style. Okay, so let's start selecting. In this case, when we use an element selector, we're going to select this span right here. We are going to pretty much just say its name. That is how we detect or determine certain elements on the page. For example, I want to get the spans on the page right now. So all the spans are going to get a background color of green right here. So now you can see at the back of our span, it has a background color of green. All right, we'll give it a color of white. Right there, there you go. You can see that it was able to change its color as well. I'll give it a font size of 18 pixels, making it so that it is a bit larger. So that is how we target things by their element. Take notice as to how we put the selector right here. It's pretty much just the element name. So pretty much for any span present on the page, for example, if I had another span right after this, it will also style it in the same way, since all the spans will get this certain styling. This is an example of an element selector. All right, that's for element selector. And class selector, let's say class selector, pretty much works in almost the same way, except we give it a specific class or a class name. So let's say this paragraph right here has a class of class name. So to target it, we use the dot. So like we used a while ago, we say dot and then the name of the class that we want to target. For example, you want to target the class of class-name. So let's target that right here. Class-name right here to determine the class selector right here. So for this, we'll give it a color of red. There you go. And a background color of pink. All right. So that is what the class selector is going to look like. It's going to style those with the specific class, as you can see right there. For example, I had another paragraph that had, let's say this is another paragraph. Notice how it does not get styled by the one with the certain class name because this paragraph tag does not have the class in this class selector. So it will not be styled. So if ever you want to target things, multiple things with a certain class or with a certain name, you could use the class name to pretty much select multiple things at once. As long as they have the class name, they will get that specific style. And I think that does not only reach to um, specific elements only, could even go past certain elements. Let's say, for example, I'll have an H3 in here, and this H3 will also have a class of class name. And for this, let's say this is a heading. So notice what happened. It will also apply that styling to elements, even though they are different elements right here. As long as they have that same class, they will get the same kind of styling. So that is for our class selector. All right, let's continue on. We have our ID selector as well. So for our ID selector, this is a bit different compared to the other two. So let's discuss that by making our ID selector here. In our style, we'll say ID selector. And for this, we'll say # ID-name to refer to a certain ID. We use pound signs for IDs, dots for classes, and just the name itself for the HTML element selector. So right here in the ID selector, we get the specific ID, in this case, # ID-name, which is referring to this paragraph right here. Okay, so for this, we'll say ID-name, and we're going to give it a font weight of bold. So now you can notice that our paragraph has bolder text. All right, the question now is, if I duplicate this line right here, line 38, it will still have that certain styling. But normally, this is not what people will do. Why is that the case? So let's try and look in our inspect right here. Let's say inspect element. So this inspect element is one of our best friends when it comes to programming or when it comes to web development. So what we do here is once we have that open, after we right click and go to inspect, or we could hit Control-Shift-I or F12, it will open this set of dev tools. All right, what we're going to do in here is let's open up the body. We want to see the contents of this file. Say body right here. And you can notice right here, we could see all of our elements on the page. This will allow us to see how much everything is taking space in our certain web page, and even how they are arranged and what kind of styles they have applied to them. It's very useful. So right here, let's try and hover over the paragraph with an ID of ID-name. Notice how there's a red squiggly line here underneath the P. So you can notice a little tooltip right here. I could take a little screenshot of that, hopefully. We'll say, for example, yep, it won't let me take a screenshot of that, but I can read it out. It says here, ID attribute value must be unique. So document has multiple elements with the same ID attribute, ID-name. So yes, the reason for that is because IDs right here are supposed to be unique. So let's think of it like in a real life setting where you have your own IDs. And if you had the same ID as another person, or say had the same ID number, that would mean that your IDs are no longer unique. But the whole essence of IDs are they are unique identifiers. They are linking to singular elements. So if you have multiple elements that have the same ID, that's pretty much breaking the rules of not just CSS and HTML, but also pretty much breaking the rules of what an ID is in the first place. It is a unique identifier. So what we're going to do is only have one element with that ID right there, and we won't run into that error anymore. And that should let us style an ID using CSS. So there you go. So in short, IDs are meant for singular elements. Classes are meant for multiple elements with the same class name. And element selectors are meant for those that are of the same element. They will have the same kind of style. So that is for our element, class, and ID selector. So let me send these in the chat right here. And we're not yet done with selectors because there are a bunch more. So let me send these codes in the chat. And if you have these so far, let's have another thumbs up. And let's discuss some more kinds of selectors. All right. Thank you, May. Let's wait for the rest. Thank you, Poleng, as well. All right. So the next one that we're going to discuss is, can you give a common example where ID is used instead of class? All right. So for those that are using ID instead of class, normally, let's say we have H3s in here, or you know what, maybe a more apt example would be something like inputs. And these inputs could have, let's say, an input of type text, or let's say an input of type, let's say, checkbox right here. And notice how it comes pre-appended with a name or an ID if you try and auto-generate it. So here for this input type checkbox, let's say the name of this will be check1. This ID will be check1 as well. So now you see our checkbox right here. Okay, so now we established that, let's remember that we need to give it a label as well. So let's put a label right beside this checkbox. We'll say this label will be for check1, and its contents will be check1 right here. It will be right beside the checkbox. All right, no problem, Prayash. Yeah, the code is sent here in the chat for your reference, so you could catch up accordingly. Right. So right here we have check1, and let's say we have another checkbox in here. Let's say its ID will be check2 instead. So we'll just replace everything here to be check2. Okay, so if I click on this label, it will select or deselect it. And same thing for this. So it's great. Now let's try and add in some styling for the IDs of both of these. So let's say I want to change the style of the ID of check1. So let's say check1 right here. So for check1, or to change the style of this certain checkbox, I believe it is also font size. Let's see if that is correct. Okay, unfortunately, that is not correct. Let's see what is the attribute to change the style of this right here. So to change the style of it, most likely need to change the width and height, since you can see its width and height right here in the box is 13 by 13. We'll go more over what this is most likely tomorrow, since this delves into some intermediate CSS. So here, let's say the width will be 20 pixels. Oh, still not changing the size of our checkbox right here. Let's see what makes this a little big. Let's say width and height will be 20 as well. Height. Okay, there you go. That looks a lot better. So if you change the width and the height at the same time, it will take up a bit more space for the check, making it a lot big. Now let's say you don't want the same style for our other checkbox. Let's say check2. So for this, you could say this will have a width of 30 pixels and a height of 30 pixels as well. So now that is a lot larger of a checkbox to take a look at. So there you go. That's a little example of the ID selector. Of course, there are more practical usages for these, but in order to discuss those, we need to discuss a lot more of CSS in order to find usages for those. And even some JavaScript, because normally we use ID selectors to pick certain singular elements on our page to give them styling and functionality. So hopefully it gives a bit of context as to how we use IDs on our web page. All right, no problem, mate, and glad I was able to answer your question. By the way, here's the code for that if you need it, right here. Here's for check 1 and check 2, and on the bottom, here are the inputs for that. Okay, perfect. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment them out. I'm going to highlight over this text, and I'm going to use Control or Command / if you're on the Mac to comment it out so we won't need to see that for now. Of course, if you want to bring that back, you could just highlight over it once again and do Control / to uncomment it to show it on the page. For now, I'll leave it commented for later reference. All right, let's talk about some more selectors. So for our selectors here, let's create another one right here. So for this, we're going to use something that we call the universal selector. So the universal selector is something that is pretty unique since it only refers to a certain character, but it's meant to style pretty much everything on our page. Hence, it is called the universal selector. Let's say, for example, this universal selector will also select things like this div. Let's say this div is styled only by the universal selector. And we'll say the same thing right here for the paragraph tag. Paragraph tag right here will say this is also styled only by the universal. Let me type correctly right here. The universal selector. All right, so now we have both a div and a paragraph that will be styled only by the universal selector. Because when we're going to style with the universal selector, it's most likely also going to style the ones we typed in previously. Because the universal selector is meant to style everything on the page. So let's try a little sample for that right now. Here in our style tag, let's create a comment and let's say universal selector. Before that though, let me send the HTML for this in the chat in case you need it right here. There we go, for the universal selector. Right, so for this, the universal selector uses a specific character to style everything on the page. And for that, we use the asterisk. The asterisk pretty much means everything on the page. So for the asterisk, we want to give it a certain kind of style. Let's say for the asterisk, we're going to give it a font family of Arial and sans serif. All right, so now take a look at everything on our page. It looks like everything on the page has been given a certain font family. This is great for giving a style to everything on the page, so we don't need to give this style to everything one by one. And it serves as like a default kind of styling for everything on the page. What are some more usages for the universal selector? So more useful ones for this are most likely going to be resetting our margin and padding. Notice when I reset the margin, it pretty much will take out the spacing between elements. Notice how everything is a lot more squished together compared to when I did not have it set to 0. It had its own kind of spacing. That's because our browser normally comes with default styling. These default stylings will end up having our elements have their own kind of margins. So as a developer, sometimes we don't want that kind of margin prepended with our certain page. So sometimes we'd want to reset that right here by setting our margin to 0. So we're going to have to set those values ourselves. So universal selector is great for doing that because the margin will be set to 0 for all of our elements on the page. So it's very helpful. And that's going to do it for our universal selector. So let me send that code right here in the chat box. All right. So that is for our universal selector. And we're not yet done. There are definitely a lot of types of selectors that we could utilize. Okay. So if you're still following along though, let's have a thumbs up on my latest message in the chat to make sure you're still good to go. All right, thank you, Pauling and Prayesh. And thank you as well, May. All right, let's continue. So here in our HTML, let's put in another kind of selector. Let's say we're going to use something that we call the grouping selector. The grouping selector is meant to, well, select elements in a certain group. For example, we have elements right here like an H1, and this H1 could be welcome to my website. Right here, there you go. And after that, we could have, maybe just have a little line break so there's a bit of space between these two. There you go, that looks a lot better. So here, we'll say H1, welcome to my website, and after that, we'll have a P right here with a class of parag, pretty much saying that it's a paragraph that we want to style later on. And we'll say this is a paragraph of text in between the opening and closing paragraph tags. So there you go. Welcome to my website. This is a paragraph of text. We're not yet done though, as we also have to put in an H2 to signify a certain section header. We'll say this will be about me. Let's create another paragraph with a class of parag. And this will be another paragraph of text. There you go. So that is looking pretty good so far. All right. So for this, we have a bunch of different elements. But what if I tell you that we could style all of these in one CSS block? Because yes, it is possible as well. So let's go here to our CSS. But before that, let me send this right here to the chat box for our grouping selector. All right, let's scroll back up right here and let's utilize the grouping selector. We'll do a little comment and we'll say for the grouping selector, it's going to style, let's say, the H1, the paragraph with a class of parag, and the H2. So we need to style all of these at the same time. So for this, we're going to use a grouping select. And to do that, we could utilize both element selectors, class selectors, and IE selectors, all of these at the same time. So let's say, for example, I want to select H1, so I'll select H1s. So that's normally how we do it. So how do we select H2s as well? So we'll say H2. So notice, to select both H1s and H2s, I put a comma in between both of them. This is how we select elements at the same time. This is how we do. So after H2, we can also throw in a certain class that we want to style as well. Let's say the H1, the H2, and also the class of parag as well. So we could give all that the same kind of styling. So notice how we have three different elements right here. And if I give them a certain styling, for example, a color of orange, notice what happens to this section of our page. It was able to style all of them at the same time. So as a developer, this allows you to plan out your styling. You could group things together and you could style them all at the same time. All right. So that is for our grouping select. Okay, hopefully that gives a bit of context on that. And let me send that CSS as well in our chat box. Okay, so you also have a bit more selectors, so don't worry. We're also going to discuss those as well. We have about 3 more. Next up, we have our descendant selector. So for our descendant selector, it is going to be, let's say something like this. We have a div right here, a div with a class of ancestor. So right here, maybe we have a certain element inside of this div that we want to style. Let's say, for example, the paragraph. And we'll say this is styled using a descendant selector. So for this, instead of styling the div itself, we want to style what is inside of the div, pretty much the descendant of the div. Here, we want to style the paragraph tag inside of the div. Okay. So to style that, let's say this will be here in the CSS. Oh, before that though, let me send this in the chat. There you go, for our descendant selector. And let's say in our CSS, let's make it a new comment as well. Descendant selector. And we're going to say for this dot ancestor. And let's make that the block for now. All right, for example, if we want to style this, let's say, for example, I want to give it, I want to make it italicized. We'll say font style, and it will be italic. So there you go. It was able to style it right there. But what if I want to do something like a color of green? Okay, I was able to style it as well. So that is for targeting the div itself. But what if I had a different kind of element in here? For example, on H3. And this H3 right here will be, this is another element. So now notice that both of these right here have the same kind of styling because we pretty much just grouped them up to have the same kind of style right here. Pretty much the contents of the ancestor div will have the font style of italic and color of green. But what if we want to pick and choose? What if we want to have just one of them have the certain style? Maybe just have the paragraph have the style. So to do that, we're going to make a space right here, and without the comma, we're going to put the element inside the ancestor that we want to target, pretty much the descendant of a certain element. So we'll say the descendant of it that we want to target is the paragraph. Now notice what we have in our div. This was styled and this was left alone. So now you can see this was styled using a descendant selector, and the other one was left as default because it is not the paragraph tag, it is an H3. And in this case, we're looking for paragraph tags inside of an ancestor element. Okay, so that is for our descendant selector. So let me send that in the chat, and let me send the updated descendant selector HTML right here as well. Okay, so we're almost done with our selectors. We have 2 more, and these 2 would refer to pseudo classes, and we also have pseudo elements. We're going to discuss both of these separately. All right, first up, we have pseudo classes, and pseudo classes refer to certain states, or these refer to certain statuses of our codes, essentially what is happening with that certain element right now. So let's try, for example, and put in a certain A tag. We'll see for the A tag right here. This will just be a placeholder link right here. I will give it a class of link. All right, so for this link right here, we'll say this is styled using a pseudo class. Okay, so now we see that our link is right here. So let's give it a bit of style. Let me send this code first in the chat though. Here we go. And let's see what we could give this. So for pseudo classes, let's make a comment right here, pseudo classes. We could certainly target the link right here, make a block for it. But when we use pseudo classes, we give it a certain colon. It will allow us to put in a certain kind of event. Maybe a user has interacted with this link. Maybe a certain thing has happened to this link. For example, we'll say link colon hover. So for pseudo classes, normally they have the single colon. And for pseudo elements, which we'll later discuss, they normally have the double colon, right? So for this, we'll say link colon hover, and we want to change the behavior of this when the user hovers over this link, because currently nothing happens when we hover over the link. So for example, I'll say color of red when I hover over the link. So let's see what happens when I hover. Notice how it turns into the red color. That's because pseudo classes are going to be tracking certain events on our page. So if I hover over this, it will change to a color of red. Right, there are also a bunch of other pseudo classes available as well. We have link active. So active right here, let's say give this a color of, let's say Alice blue right here. So when I hover over it, it's going to be red, but when I click on it, it will change it, or when I'm holding click, it will change it so that it's active, and we'll make it so that I am currently clicking on the element, and I will change the color while I am clicking on it, like so. All right, so that is for link of active. There's also link visited. Essentially, if you visited this link, or if you've interacted with this link already, say color will be black. So notice what happened to our link right here. Since we've already clicked on this link before, it is now showing a color of black. So that is for that link right there. We've already visited this link, so it will show in black. So it will show it like this. Of course, if we hover over it, it will not take place, as we need to put that at the last part of our code. I'll give a little explanation as to why that's the case in a bit. But for now, you can see that when I hover over it, it will become red. Okay. So that is for link hover active and visited. Very helpful in creating pseudo classes. All right. So there's now probably a certain question that may pop up in your mind. But before that, let me send the code here in our chat. Question is, when I put the link visited right here on the bottom, and when I hover over the link, why is it not turning red? That is a great question. And if I put this link over here on the bottom, it turns red. So why is this the case? Why is this certain behavior of CSS? So we'll do this as a little bit of a recitation, more of a kind of like give a little observation. Why do you think this is the case? You could give us a little guess in the chat. And let's see if we could try and analyze what's happening in the code ourselves. That's pretty much one of the most important things as programming, analyzing why certain code works in certain ways. So I'll repeat the question once again. If this link visited is after the link hover, if I hover over this link, it will not turn red. But if I put this hover after the visited, it will turn red. Why is this the case? Of course, if you don't know the answer, you can also type in the chat, don't know. And we can just give the answer if you're not familiar or if you don't want to take a guess. Yeah, I know it's a little confusing, but this is one of the prime rules of CSS that I think should be discussed before we continue on. All right, any guesses? Or if you don't have any guesses, just let us know. You could say, I'm not sure or no idea. And we could give the answer as to why that is the case. It reads the code from top to bottom. All right, that is pretty much the answer I was looking for. Yes, that's correct. Let's try and break that down. It reads the code from top to bottom. So what does that mean? So it pretty much starts our CSS right here from the very, very top of our stack. So right here, we say span is the very first thing the CSS will read. And the next will be the class name, ID name, etc., 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 until we reach the links in here. Now notice, all of these links with their pseudo classes, if we take all those out, because these pseudo classes pretty much hold no bearing, they're pretty much all just link selectors. Notice that. So because our code is being read from top to bottom, it will pretty much read this first, and the ones on the bottom will pretty much overwrite that behavior. For example, let's say if the link right here, let's try and remove their pseudo classes for now. So right here, you can see the color is red. But for example, I comment these two out, and it shows link. It's not very visible right now, but that's the color of Alice Blue. Right. So what CSS does is, since it reads from top to bottom, it will get the one on the most bottom to pretty much base its base a certain style. So it's like overwriting a certain style. In this case, you could see a link of color here on the top, but you can also see one here on the bottom. So what CSS says is, I will prefer this one since this is on the bottom of the code, and this is going to pretty much overwrite the one on the top. So you'll notice that our link is now a color of black compared to a color of Alice Blue. And that's the same case right here. If we change the link to be color red on the very bottom, it will take this over the first group. All right, now let's bring in the concepts of pseudo classes. We'll say right here, if it is active, if it is listed, and if it is hover. All right, let's see if I click on this right here. Notice how nothing happens. The reason for that is, just like we discussed a while ago, is going to prioritize this link of hover at the very bottom, right? So probably the best way to arrange all of these elements would most likely be the visited on the very top. We want to show the visited first, and the active will be on the very bottom, since we want that to have the highest priority. So the lowest priority is when the user is not interacting with it. So it will just show it by default as link of visited. Then next, if the user is hovering over it, we will show a link of hover. And lastly, if it is active, we will then overwrite it with the active styling. So there you go. That's a bit of a context as to why this ordering of the pseudo classes is done. But most of the time, as beginner developers, we normally just use the link hover right here for most of what we do. So if you're not sure on how to apply visited and active, no worries. These are not normally used in beginner projects, so you don't need to worry about these for now. Just to give a bit of context as to what pseudo classes can be. All right, so that is for our pseudo classes. Let me send this in the chat once again, and hopefully it gives a bit of context as to why the links are arranged in this manner. That's because, once again, we go back to the definition of CSS. We are dealing with cascading style sheets, meaning cascade will go from top to bottom, with the top being the low priority and the bottom being the high priority. All right, and that's going to do it for our pseudo classes. So let's just make sure that everyone is still on the same page. Let's have a thumbs up on my latest message if you're still good to go. All right, thank you, Pauling, and thank you, Prayash, as well. And thank you as well, May. All right, so let's talk about the last one right here. Let's talk about pseudo elements. All right. So for this, notice how I'm not going to be doing a certain, well, I guess I could do an extra element right here. Let's say paragraph tag. Let's say this is styled using a pseudo element. All right. And for this, we'll see the paragraph right here. We'll have a class of pseudo element. We'll target this in our CSS. All right, let's send that here in our chat right here. And let's use the pseudo element right here to pick certain parts of our HTML. So normally what we use in pseudo elements would be things like, let's say dot pseudo elements. I think that should be the right one. Yes, that's the right class. And normally what we do for this is we use double colons and we look for a certain thing that will represent what we're going to create in our CSS. In this case, what people normally use would be the before and after to generate new content. For example, I'll have right here a before. So right here for the before, this will allow us to put a certain element before our element, or in this case, put certain content before an element. For example, to put in content in a before, we use the content property. And for the content property, we'll say something like maybe a closing angle bracket and a space. There you go. So notice what we just showed in here. We've just generated some content before the pseudo element class paragraph that we have in here. So if we try and inspect this and we hover over this, notice how we have a before, and it's pretty much selecting our angle bracket right there. This is the before. And after that, it's going to be our text content. If you want to have things like maybe in your before, you want to have maybe some quotes. So let's say you have a quote right here on the first part, and maybe you could also have one for the after. We'll say pseudo element after. You also want to have a quote as well. So take a look at how it looks right now. You have a quote in the beginning and the end of our paragraph. And notice how it looks like before and after the certain content. So you could use this to add content before and after an element, and maybe later on even change their positions, but that is something that's dealt with in intermediate CSS. But for now, pseudo elements allow you to change things right here. Why backslash before quote? That's because if we take that out, we're going to get an error, since our quotes right here is meant to pretty much take in a certain kind of text. So if we put 3 quotes in here, that is not the right format, because the content is meant to take in two kinds of two quotes only, and then some certain text right here. But if I want to put quotes before and after, let's say the content right here will be quotes, I use this backslash before the quote because it is an example of an escape character. Essentially, it will not treat this quote like a quote that's meant to take in text. It's just meant to be a character to be put in the content. So use this backslash to make sure that we don't get any errors. All right. I'm glad I was able to answer your question there, Prayash. And that's an example of a pseudo element. Of course, for the pseudo elements right here, you could also give it some certain kind of style. We'll say the color of this could be maybe green. There you go. Notice how our before and after now has a green hue. Maybe you could even change it by going to this box right here and changing its color. So you could take a little look at what color may be best for you. Maybe this blue will be good. If you even want to change its kind of color, you could click right here to toggle color options. You could change it to be a hex code or even HSL, which is not very used right now. So you could take a pick which one applies to you. Normally people would use hex colors though. So that is what I'm going to change it to be. So there you go. So now you could notice that it's a pretty dark blue. Let's make it a bit lighter. There you go. So that is how we style our pseudo elements. And they pretty much appear before and after certain parts in our code. Okay, and that is going to do it for our pseudo elements. So let me send this in the chat box as well. Okay, hopefully you're also able to do this on your end. So if you're good to go, let's have a thumbs up on my latest message. All right. Let's wait for the rest. Was this before and after used for? Yes. So the before and after here is used for putting elements before and after a certain element. And it's something that maybe you don't want to be selectable in our HTML. Notice how when I hover, it will not select the before and after elements right here. So these are things that are just purely for styling. These elements are purely for styling your elements. That's pretty confusing, what do you call it? Pretty confusing terminology. But just know that if you want to create some elements that you don't want the user to select, it will not go over the quotes because they're just meant for styling. When I move my mouse over, I don't see any effect there. I think you're referring to the pseudo classes, and for the pseudo classes right here, they are referring to these links over here. All right. So let me send that to you right here for the updated order of our pseudo classes. So you could try that out and see if you hover over it and it will be able to do a certain kind of effect. All right, let me know if that was able to fix your error right there. All right. So now we have, the pseudo element. How do you do the before and after tricks in your browser? So for that, you use this certain styling right here. So this styling will put in a certain content. In this case, we want to put quotes before and after our text. So you could see here the before quote and the after quote here for this text. And when I click and drag over this right here, I'm just clicking and dragging with my mouse over the, I see a bottom window on your browser. Ah, yes. Okay. So, yep, thank you for clarifying the question. You right click and go to inspect. That is what we call our dev tools. If you can't see it after right-clicking, try pressing your F12 key or Control-Shift-I or Command-Shift-I if you are on a Mac. And that will open the bottom window, or if you see it on the side, it'll also be on the side window as well. And you could see it right here. If you could click on this icon right here on the left of this window right here, click on it, and you could select elements on the page to see their certain attributes and styles. Let's try and select this pseudo element right here. And we click on the contents, and you could see the before and after that we put in our CSS. The before containing our before quote, and the after containing our after quote. And in between that is going to be our text. So hopefully that gives a bit of context for that. And hopefully I was able to help you see that window. All right. So let me know if you ran into any more problems on your end, and we'll try our best to address those. All right. Thank you. Glad I was able to address that. All right. So that is for our selectors, and hopefully that gives a bit of context as to how that works. Right. So with that being said, that is going to be the last thing for tonight's session. We've definitely discussed a lot of CSS for today, and we have a lot more of CSS to discuss. So for that, we're going to save that for tomorrow's discussion. So don't worry about the codes that we talked about today. We're going to send that in our Slack group chat for your reference. So no need to worry about that. And for now, what we're going to do is leave you off with a certain activity. So let me get the activity right here. Okay. Apologies for the wait. Let's just wait for my activity to load. Okay. And I believe it should be this one. Let's just wait for my display to load. There you go. Here it is. All right, hopefully you're seeing my screen correctly. This is going to be for our CSS activity. So if we remember our HTML activity, what we want to do is pretty much just utilize some of the CSS selectors we started discussing for tonight. So in this case, you could use things like color, font size, and even background color to do some preliminary styling. And since you have the power to use CSS selectors and some of the typography, could start out with that for now. Of course, this activity is going to span for the rest of our CSS discussions. So this activity will be kind of like a multi-day activity where we're just going to check on how your activities are doing day by day. Of course, it's not a requirement. It's more of scaling up and kind of reinforcing what kind of skills or what kind of things we've learned, pretty much reinforcing those learnings and pretty much getting more experienced with CSS. So I believe this is one of the best ways to do so. So pretty much to sum up with this CSS activity right here, of course, you could be a lot more advanced and try out more kinds of properties. But for now, what we expect is to get your HTML activity, your activity number 1, and add some CSS to that HTML file. So that is pretty much it. So right now, we're just going to utilize some of the CSS that we discussed for tonight to style up our HTML pages. So let me send this activity here in the chat. And don't worry, I'll also send this activity in our Slack group chat as well. Okay. So for now, what we expect is going to be the typography and the CSS selectors, since we have a lot more CSS to discuss. But if you want to be advanced, of course, you could take a look at some more CSS selectors, and a source that I'd recommend to look at that, or sorry, not CSS selectors, CSS properties. And a resource that I'd recommend for that would be W3 Schools. That is a great way to check for certain properties that you could try and apply to your certain CSS elements. But don't worry, we're going to discuss some of these in tomorrow's session and maybe on Monday as well. So look forward to that. All right, and that's going to do it for tonight's session. Hopefully that gives you something to do for the rest of the session. And we once again want to thank you all for making it out for tonight. And good luck with the activity. And we will see you again tomorrow. So if you don't have any more concerns or questions, you are free to do your own thing and continue with the activity. Thank you and have a good evening. Thank you, Prayash.